Welcome to this year's Hamburg Portfolio Review panel. Sorry for the delay, we had some technical issues and we hope these are solved now. If you see question marks in our eyes, then this is again the technical issue. We'll hope everything works well. So, who am I? Who are my guests today? I'm Sebastian Schroeder, and I'm really happy to talk to you about AI and what's been going on in the past year with artificial intelligence in photography. And I'm not here alone, I'm here with Yvonne Tine in the studio, and I have two guests who I cannot see right now online. There they are, Santiago Lyon from Adobe from New York and Heinrich Holtgreve from Agentur Ostkreuz in Berlin. Thank you that you guys are here. Thank you in the audience that you're here. I'm really looking forward to this talk. And because it's always a question of introduction, we said, who is it going to do? Is it me or is it you? And we decided that the guests are going to introduce themselves because they know best what they actually do in the world. So, Santiago, I'll hand it over to you. Who are you? What are you doing? And yeah, let's see from there.
So, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Santiago Lyon. I work at Adobe, where I head up Advocacy and Education for something called the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is a large open source community of media and technology companies and others working to help address the problem of mis- and disinformation. In a previous life, I was a journalist for most of my life, son of a journalist. I worked for 35 years, 20 years as a photographer in the field, including a decade spent covering war and conflict around the world, mainly for the Associated Press, and then almost 15 years as vice president for photography at the Associated Press, overseeing the entirety of the photo department there. So in some ways, the work that I'm doing now is a logical extension of my work as a journalist, but from a slightly different perspective. Very happy to be here, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much. Yvonne, who are you and why are you here today?
Yeah, I'm Yvonne Tine. I'm a media artist based in Berlin. I'm working with AI since 3 years, so AI-based technologies. And I'm interested in the relationship between technology and the body, and how AI shaped this visual culture in these terms or in our time. And what I did is I trained some models, my own models with stock photography of bodies, and developed works like videos, mostly it's installations, so it's some videos. I made some sculptures by hand, which are inspired by the output of the AI, and I bring this all together in a room, also to challenge the digital and the real space, or kind of have a interaction between these different kind of medias. And yeah, my training was actually not with an open source platform, so I was also interested in how this technology will form a new body images without any way for me to interact in the algorithm of the AI. This is, for example, performance I did just recently, which is also kind of a hybrid between my real body, the body suit I made with AI based material, and yeah, I mix all this kind of media together, and there's overlapping between analog material, my handmade sculptures, and the images I generated with the AI.
Thank you very much. Very amazing work. I'm really looking forward to be talking about this later on. And then Heinrich, who are you and what are you doing in your life?
Hello, everybody, and sorry for that I couldn't make it to, where is it, Altona? So hello from St. Georg. I'm a photographer, basically. Yes, I spent the last decade or so mostly working in the journalistic fields and the editorial fields, and during the last 2-3 years, more and more other stuff came into my focus. For example, teaching. I teach at Ostkreuzschule Berlin and will soon teach photography also in Bremen at the University of the Arts. And I do a little bit of lecturing on topics such as AI and technology and photography stuff. So this is what I do to make my living. And I also do things to express myself. You could call it free projects. And those are usually centered around also technological issues. For example, the internet. I'm interested in taking pictures of the internet, which I do like take pictures of cables or buildings or data centers. So the physical aspect of that. And that I'm also doing since almost a decade. And it became a long-term project. And these days I travel across the German border together with my friend Moritz Metz. He's a journalist at Deutschland Radio. He's a radio journalist. And that tour around the German border is our common project. It's called Internet Explorers. And the concept is that we visit every place where the German country is connected to the neighboring countries via fiber optic cables, and where those cables leave or enter our country. So we visit train bridges or bushes or seashores and very mundane places, and we take pictures there and record a podcast. And you can, of course, subscribe to it on every platform. It's called Internet Explorers. Thank you.
I'd like to have two brief introductions into the topics of AI. The first thing is Santiago. You are working with Adobe on the Content Authenticity Initiative, and that is something fairly new. It's been going on for 4 years. 2019 is when you started, but I think most of people in our business still haven't heard about this, or many of them at least. So why don't you give us an overview on what your work is, what you do, and what you're trying to achieve with the Content Authenticity Initiative?
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Sure.
All right. So the Content Authenticity Initiative was started by Adobe in late 2019, really in response to the problem of mis and disinformation that we see in our lives every day. And since Adobe makes a lot of very powerful software that, when it falls into the wrong hands, can be used to spread mis and disinformation, we thought it was important to take on a leadership role to also address the problem. And so from the get-go, we wanted this to be an open source initiative. So all the work that we're doing is transparent and available for everybody, while at the same time being incorporated into some Adobe products. More recently, we've seen the phenomenon of AI-generated images. And what we're seeing in this space is that increasingly these images are becoming hyper-realistic and difficult to discern from quote-unquote real images, which has added impetus to our work. Our membership at the initiative has grown significantly since late 2019. On the left here, you can see some of the major media partners. From Germany, we have Axel Springer and DPA. And from around the world, we have major news agencies and consumer-facing organizations. And then you can see on the right some of the hardware and software partners we have. And we think it's precisely the size and makeup of this Content Authenticity Initiative community that will allow us to succeed. When we looked at the fight against mis and disinformation, we basically saw 4 areas that we think are important: detection, which we're not involved in, which involves uploading files to programs that look for telltale signs of manipulation. The reason we're not involved in that on the Content Authenticity Initiative is because it's not scalable, it's not particularly accurate, and while it certainly can be useful, we're more focused on 3 other areas. Policy, which involves advising lawmakers and policymakers around the world about the state of technology and what's coming. Education, which involves media literacy and consumer literacy, explaining to people both in the classroom and consumers of media as to what's going on and best practices to navigate a complicated landscape. And at the top, of course, we have provenance, which is at the heart of the Content Authenticity Initiative. By provenance, we mean the basic trustworthy facts about the origins of a piece of digital content, whether it's an image, video, audio recording, or other, showing where it came from, what changes might have been made to it along its journey, and then sharing some or all of that information with the viewer. So this is the use case for photography. We start with capture. We're working with all the major camera companies and smartphone companies to get this technology into their devices at production, meaning in the not too distant future, when you go to buy a camera or a smartphone, it will come out of the box with this technology installed, and then you as the user can choose to turn it on or off, depending on what the default setting is. What this does is secures the origins of the pictures from the beginning. It also secures all of the valuable EXIF and IPTC metadata that has very important information in it, but that is not particularly secure. Next, we move on to editing, integrating this technology into editing tools, both Adobe and non-Adobe tools, given the open source nature of the work. And here, any changes that you make to a file in the editing process get recorded and added to the file as a secure layer of metadata. Next, we're working with publishers and publishing systems to leave this metadata intact, because most metadata nowadays gets stripped off of files automatically. The reason that we're interested in leaving it intact is because then we can share some or all of it with the viewer through a clear and universal user experience. And so we call these secure layers of metadata content credentials. And they are visible at any point in a piece of content's journey to show where it came from and what might have happened to it. So that's the use case for photography, but there will be almost identical use cases for video, audio, and also for AI. Adobe recently got into the generative AI space with a product called Firefly, and all output from Firefly is very clearly labeled as such. In other words, when you create something on Firefly, embedded into the file is a content credential that says this was made with a machine. Additionally, we're seeing other major generative AI providers starting to label their output. So we're in conversations with the DALL-Es and the Stabilities and the Midjourneys, and all seem to want a layer of transparency. And so we're working with them towards that end. And then lastly, the other thing we're doing is facilitating the ability for creators to label their content "do not train," so that it can't be used in AI data training sets if they don't want to. Because as we know, these training sets are a source of some controversy, and there's a lot of legal cases going on about the way the training data was scraped and is being scraped to train these machines. So that's a really quick overview of the Content Authenticity Initiative. This QR code will take you to our website, contentauthenticity.org. And membership is free. Companies and individuals can join. And we welcome new members who are interested in this field. And I'll leave it at that.
And before we now go into an open discussion here, I want to ask Heinrich, can you please give us an overview? You're an expert on what's going on in the AI market specifically. Can you give us a brief overview of the different players that are in the market, and especially what their goals are and what their motivations are with developing these AI tools?
Sure. So there are basically all the major platform giants involved in this race. Some people might call it even an arms race. So there's Google with multiple AI ventures, the most popular one being Bard. Then there's Amazon. They're part in the game with, of course, Alexa, the voice-based assistant, but which is run layers of AI and will in the future be even more AI based. I read, but Amazon also, it's a little peculiar because Amazon is the internet basically. Most data centers and most infrastructure is run by Amazon these days. Like, I don't know, it's a majority. So other companies use AWS, Amazon Web Services, as their basis to operate many messengers, many websites, many platforms, etc. So then we have Meta, the parent company by WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook and Threads. They are betting big on AI too. They are having multiple models, and the most infamous being Llama. Infamous because the first version was not so well received, and so they scrapped it and brought out another one, or are bringing out another one. And then there's Apple, which it's also a peculiar case because they are mostly in the hardware business, and they pride themselves in being the privacy focusing company. And as we all know, Siri sucks. So, but it sucks for a reason, because Apple doesn't use that data mountains that Google and Amazon and Meta are hoarding. So yeah, but recent rumors suggest that Apple is also investing heavily into AI and generative AI. So those big platforms are betting big on it. And Microsoft, for example, how could I forget Microsoft? They've invested 11 billion into OpenAI. OpenAI is the company who is creating ChatGPT and DALL-E and other tools. And Microsoft also incorporated ChatGPT into their Bing product. So there's a lot of intertwining going on. And then there's another hardware company, NVIDIA. It's the company who's also building or producing the building blocks used by AI and used by all AI companies, the graphics cards. When I grew up in the 90s, I was happy to hold the first NVIDIA graphics card in my hands for my gaming PC back in the day. But these days, NVIDIA is also the 8th largest company in the world right now, when you regard the market capitalization. And yes, of course, Adobe. Adobe is, I just checked, it's number 44 of the world's biggest companies right now. But Adobe, since announcing Firefly, is also a major player in the AI space. And its stock price also climbed significantly since doing so, I might add.
Thank you very much for this quick overview. And now I feel that everyone who is here has gotten the introduction that we need to actually go into depth, go into the interesting part is your opinions on what's going to happen, because this whole AI movement is so fresh and so new that many of us kind of feel lost by the speed that is overrunning us, more or less. Yvonne, you've been working with AI images for years, way longer than the public has, I guess. I think 3 years, you said, and for the most part, DALL-E, I think, and Stable Diffusion are out for about 1 year. Were you surprised by the intensity of the discussion that when these two came out, and then later when ChatGPT came out in January, were brought to the public?
Well, I think in the art world where I work, there were a lot of artists already exploring AI, but it was, of course, the access was more difficult. So there were not the main platforms. You could just make an account and then you just pay a little amount of money and you produce your own AI work. So mostly before you had to either have someone to program your model, or there were some platforms, but not for prompting. So yeah, I think it got really the public discussion began when it was kind of available for a really easy way, the access to just wait. I mean, DALL-E at the beginning, they had this waiting list. You had to sign and you had to wait a few weeks or depending. But yeah, I think then it got really like visible. that these
Were you
systems...
surprised by the speed that the public interest grew, or did you expect that from the get-go?
I don't know if I'm really like, if I can say the public in general was interested, but of course the bubble of image producing and people are producing and are in the image world, working in this world. This was really fast. And then maybe with ChatGPT, it became a bit more public also to other people. They're not really involved in this kind of image production world. I don't know. No, I wasn't surprised. I think I was more surprised that the discussion began so late because I was already exploring it a little bit before, but of course it was really like a small world at this time. But yeah.
How was it with you, Santiago? I mean, you were working on this for years, but you were working on authenticity and not on AI. Did that kind of overrun you, or did you expect that this would happen sooner or later from what you knew from the inside?
You know, Adobe, like a lot of big technology companies, has research labs who spend a lot of time and effort looking into new technologies. And so we had been seeing AI and how it was developing through what were called generative adversarial networks, which was sort of the precursor to the technology that we see now. So we were sort of aware of the capabilities of generative AI, but it was really, I think, the advent of DALL-E more recently, and the ability for these companies to scrape massive data training sets off of the internet in order to have a super high level of sophistication about what they could generate. Because in the past, it was more, creating artificial faces and things of that nature. So not really surprised about the development of the technology. Perhaps a little bit surprised in terms of how fast it spread, in part because Stability.ai, who makes Stable Diffusion, chose to open source the underlying code, as I understand it, and that allowed for this to be adopted by a great many more companies and individuals. And now all of those companies, or many of those companies, are monetizing this. You pay a subscription to access the tools. So, technology is always progressing. I wasn't that surprised to see it head in the direction that it did.
The goal of your initiative changed somewhat, or is it actually just more important that the original goals are followed?
No, the goal of the initiative is the same. It's about transparency and being able to see the origins of digital files, where they came from, how they were manipulated, and then share some or all of that information with the consumer. What this has done has actually been quite beneficial to the Content Authenticity Initiative because it's attracted a lot of attention. In other words, we were getting attention, our community was growing, we're making good progress on the technology front. And then in the last year or so, with the advent of generative AI, we've seen even more attention to our work, especially in the legislative space, where we're seeing, the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, the US Congress, national governments around the world, looking at how, from a legislative point of view, governments should address the phenomenon of generative AI, given the potential dangers that lurk. And so, we're busy on that slide I showed about the 4 pillars in the fight against disinformation. Policy was one of them. And so we're busy working with policymakers to help them understand what's going on. And we believe that the technology that underpins the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is based on a technological standard formed by a different group that we founded a couple of years ago that sits within the Linux Foundation, a group called the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. That's the technical standard upon which all our work is based. And what we do is we take that technical standard and build open source tools with it. So the C2PA standard is also getting a lot of attention in addition to our implementation of that standard.
I was sorry.
Please.
by the birth of the internet. It was in the 60s when machines could suddenly talk to each other across the USA, across the coasts. But it wasn't until, I don't know, 30 years later, in the early 90s, where the web was invented. So the web as an application for the internet, like you sit in front of a computer, open a browser, go to a website, this is the web. Nowadays we use internet and web interchangeably, but the web is just one application of the internet, like email and messaging and so on. And I think with AI, it's a little bit the same. Like AI is a very old principle. It's also decades old. I think it's also born around the 60s. And Santiago is always using the term generative AI, and this is actually very important because only the generative part is the new stuff. So prompting something, hitting enter, and receiving something out of it, that's the new wave of AI applications. But AI has been there for decades already and doing other stuff like pattern recognition.
Something that I really want to address here, because if we've seen the image of the Pope at the beginning in your presentation, and we may have it here as well. This is something that's created a buzz in March when it came out, but then in the end, we were able to do this for at least 20 years, ever since Adobe brought out the first Photoshop. So I wasn't surprised that this would be coming, but I was surprised that it would create such a buzz. Santiago, do you think it's a good thing that these tools make the broad public question photography as a symbol of truth? So your aims can be reached easier, and we can all agree at some point now we can't trust images anymore. Isn't that actually a good thing?
You know, tools like generative AI, I think, are in some ways wonderful. They enhance creativity. They allow people to experiment with technology. I don't see any downside to these kind of tools. I think what's really important, though, is two things. In some cases, how these tools are used. And if they're used by actors who are, governments or other individuals or organizations who are attempting to mislead people with agenda-driven campaigns, then that's a little bit more worrisome, because what you're doing for a lot of people is creating things that are hyper-realistic, and people look at them and say, well, is that real or not? I have no idea. You know, I'm supposed to be a somewhat of an expert in this area, given my background. And when I saw the picture of the Pope wearing the puffy coat, at first glance, I thought it was completely plausible, given the character of this particular Pope and given the reality or the apparent, real quality of the image. So, I think what we're focused in on is tool building. We're not passing judgment here as to how the tools should be used, but rather we see a benefit to using them to allow consumers to make their own judgments based on additional information that they have. That said, it's not a turnkey or a light switch solution by itself. The problem of mis and disinformation is very complex. It involves education, it involves government, it involves society, it involves, human behavior. But we think that the work that we're doing is important. And as to whether people can believe photography or not, sure, there are certain kinds of photography that are absolutely believable based on where they come from, based on the source of the imagery. When you see images from the Associated Press or Reuters or DPA or Agence France Presse or, any number of consumer-facing organizations, you can be pretty sure, if not 100% sure, that those are real images, because there's a very robust system of checks and balances out there that ensure that. However, when you're, surfing social media and you see material and you're not sure where it came from, that's a little bit more problematic. And with the advent of these generative AI technologies that have really lowered the bar to access for this technology, anybody can, get this technology, type in a few prompts, and create a hyper-realistic image, and then put it on social media and say it was this or it was that. So I think what's really important here are the tools for transparency, but also this idea of media literacy, that people should check the sources of their imagery and do some due diligence. And not everybody's going to do that, or people are going to do that only about images that they really care about or topics that they care about. And that speaks to the broader issue of the intersection of photography and journalism and society as a whole.
If it wouldn't be a good idea to, first off, create the understanding that we shouldn't believe images at all in the first place. Yvonne, do you think, is it naive to think photography as a truth-telling medium?
We still trust it, no? If you make a passport, you need to have a biometric pass photo. So as Santiago said, like, I think there's many areas where we still can be really sure that this is trustful images. But I think, like, since, I mean, I did a work more than 14 years ago, I think, where I already spoke about how we should request photographs, because there was the editing already is existing and images were already edited. And I think it's a bit surprising that now the big discussion about trusting photographs is developing and not already much longer, because I think this problem of you can edit with good software, with Photoshop, since many years. So I think maybe what's the difference now is that you don't need to have any kind of knowledge or skills in photography and to know how to work with Photoshop anymore, because you just need to know to describe a picture, like making a good description as a prompt, and then you get easy, like it's really quick and fast to get a good generated hyper-realistic image. And maybe that's the difference. So what Santiago said is, like, everyone now can produce images with their own truth. So this is maybe the difference to the time before AI.
Heinrich, if you think about what Santiago and the whole initiative want to achieve, that, to me, it sounds very much like a very good solution, but at the same time, I'm a little bit afraid that we are maybe, with images, going to the same direction as we are with cookie banners at some point. Because what we wanted to achieve is that we have more data security of and know what's happening around us in the internet, and now we're kind of stuck with a cookie ban on every website. It's kind of destroying the experience a lot. And what I'm wondering, what's your take on, if we're looking at images, and every image will have the metadata applied, and we have overlays that show us all the different steps that an image has gone through. Do you think this is something that we should expect when we're looking at the initiative and the goals of the initiative?
I'm a big fan of the CAI, and my agency Oscar is also a member, and I think it's the best there is right now. I mean, it's a good effort. It's probably even the best effort I can see right now in the industry. However, as you also talked about the truth or the inherent truth of photography, I like the German term Wahrheitsversprechen, so it's the promise of truth. And I think in all photography, be it commercial or advertisement photography, and even journalistic photography, it can only be and always be a promise of truth, because there's so much subjectivity involved in the whole chain. Like me, the photographer, I grew up in a certain place with certain values at a certain time. I have my own filters and I take my picture, and you can call it subjectivity in a word. And it's a good thing. We should cherish it, but we should also keep an eye out on our industry, because our industry, like when we look at the numbers and the economy, like the economical terms of the journalistic industry, it sucks. It's in shambles. Nobody has money for anything. So it's important to not only hire one photographer but multiple photographers. So multiple subjectivities can create like a rainbow of truth, promises of truths. And I think as an industry, it's super important to try to maintain that multiple angled viewpoints. And yeah, I think the CAI is a good effort. However, the real, like the end boss, I think, is the social media space, because there's the Wild West, and there's no checks and balances, and no editors, no specialized documentation apparatus like in Die Zeit or Der Spiegel. They have people just working on fact checking, and of course nobody does it on social media. And I wonder if Santiago could shed some light on if there are any planned or secret, or if maybe under wraps still, but if there are any talks within Adobe and the social, or the CAI and the social media companies.
Yeah, no, we're in conversation with all of the major social media companies to explain what we're doing. And there is certainly some interest. But then there's another methodology here that we're also developing that involves invisible watermarking. So this is the notion that when you create a content credential, when you create the credential, it adds an invisible watermark, what's called a steganographic watermark, to the file. And that invisible watermark accompanies the file. And then through the use of, or the development of, a browser plugin, we can then use the browser plugin to detect whether an image has an invisible watermark. And then we can use that invisible watermark to link it back to the content credential that was originally created for it, regardless as to whether the content credential has actually accompanied the file. And so this allows us to check the provenance of images on social media without getting the social media companies involved, because it's through your browser. And so we're very close to, rolling this technology out. Of course, it's slightly complicated in the sense that it requires the user to install the plugin until such time as the browser companies put it on by default. But it's a good complement to the approach that I outlined before that was based on the secure metadata accompanying the file. So I think, one way or the other, we'll get to the ability for people to see the provenance of files. Then over time, when we think about what success looks like, it's really about ubiquity, and this notion that if we reach a critical mass of content that has content credentials on it, then the content that does not have content credentials on it stands out precisely because of their absence, and would encourage people to take a closer look at it. But again, that's also dependent on consumer education, media literacy, and to some degree legislation. So it's all pieces of a puzzle.
When we're staying there, Heinrich, if an online outlet like Zeit, Spiegel, New York Times, or other outlets report with breaking news, it's always images of the moment, which is fine. But then when we're talking about science topics, education, philosophy, or comparable topics, they often use stock images to illustrate the article or the topic of the article. Is it a problem if they used AI-generated images instead of that stock imagery?
My short answer would be it's not a problem if they used generated imagery, if they label it as such. And broader speaking, I think illustrations or illustrative images taken by camera or by a generative tool, whatever, I think they are becoming more commonplace. And my personal theory is that it's harder to research those topics, those intangible topics, like, I don't know, what did you give an example? Science or health, or
how do I bring up my child and all that kind of stuff, like educational, motherhood, family types of topics.
And of course, at some point, I think it's just economical to say, come on, let's stop the search and let's generate something. I think it's also, an economical topic, like the image boards or the image editorial teams are shrinking. So there's less time for research, I think. Not at every outlet, but at the broader strokes of the industry are like this. So I think the temptation will even rise in the coming months and years to stop research of existing material or even commission new material by photographers and to just use generative material. I think that might be the trend, yes.
Yvonne, you're doing generated work, and in the last couple of days I've talked to a lot of journalists, editing people, and photographers, and some of the talks came to the conclusion that if picture desks would use generated images, that would probably be the end of stock imagery. But then at the same time, the editors don't have the time to create the work themselves. Do you think it would be sufficient or a good idea to implement new business models also for artists to say we're the ones who take the time to create those stock generated images for journalist topics like education, all that. So we basically we're creating the new stuff, but we can do it way cheaper, and we can at the same time kind of bring out our artistic views to the world.
Well, I'm not sure if I understood the question in the right way, but I think right now we are still training these AIs with real material, of real photographs. And if these photographs are not taken anymore because it's cheaper to generate them, then of course the generated image of generated images will explore. So it's going to be a generated image. So I was wondering what that makes to the real image. Maybe it's getting more hyper real, or it doesn't even look like a real photograph anymore. I mean, it's really something. I don't know if it would be better to generate instead of having these stock agencies. But I agree with Heinrich, because it's I think it's a question of money in the world of media, especially magazines. In paper, they almost not existing anymore. Like they get less money. Lots of these kind of medias just exist digitally, and I think it's it would be nice to have still photography, real photographs taken by a camera. So maybe it's also going in the other direction at the end, because everything is generated. People start to go back to the real, like, analog photograph. So because you see that in art, that or like the young generation, young people already explore like analog film, and they never grew up with it. But I think maybe it can be even the opposite effect. But I think in the commercial part, it's possible that at the end it's stock photography will be not existing anymore. But I don't know. I'm more like an artist, so I think it's like I'm thinking about these questions, of course, because I'm really know a lot of photographers, but I don't know what these technologies will change. Of course, it's more. I guess it would be really sad not having real
Images anymore,
photographs by a camera and a lens. And also, what's totally missing is the interaction between the people. No, like, if you want to take a portrait, you still have interaction between the photographer and the person. So people were just sitting in front of the computer and generating prompts to generate pictures. So maybe also this is not what producers would like to do. So I don't know.
What I wondered, I mean, the whole process is, we were always talking digitally. But then just recently, it was exposed that the Boda Group here in Germany, it's one of the biggest publishing houses, has released a food magazine that was created, or all images were fully created on generative AI, and they were exposed because they didn't mark those images as being generated, and there was a huge shitstorm about it. Santiago, are there any plans on how the CAI is going to handle print as well, or are you just going to try to figure out a way how to do it digitally?
Well, the main focus, of course, is digital, because that allows for much, deeper sort of investigation or analysis of things because of their digital nature. Print could conceivably be done, but it would need some kind of digital interface, maybe a QR code that, takes a look at the image and combined with image recognition software. I don't know. We're not focused on print right now, in part because as a percentage of the overall media landscape, it's quite small. But I think eventually there'll probably be a way to establish the provenance of print publications, but it will be dependent on publishers creating some kind of digital link that will allow somebody to then analyze the image online.
Think about this. If, for example, the CAI standard would become a standard, a mandatory for picture desks around the world, would you see as it as the end of stock photography?
Not necessarily. I mean, stock photography is, a massive industry. It's a much bigger part of photography than, say, editorial photography. And the sheer volume of stock photography that's being produced every year is huge. I mean, if you think the news agencies like AP and Reuters and AFP are more or less distributing 1 million pictures a year, about 3,000 pictures every 24 hours. The stock photography imagery, each agency of the big agencies is processing 1 million pictures a week. And so it's a massive collection of imagery. The issue with stock photography has often been around search. With so many images there, how do you find the images that you need? And so when you think about generative AI as a tool, you can think about it in many ways. You can either go just with the output of the generative AI itself, or you can use it as a sort of a co-pilot and combine it with existing stock photography to create whatever it is you need created. And I think, I would say one of the most important things now as we continue down this exciting digital world journey is this notion of transparency. Like, people should be able to create whatever they want. I have no issue with that. But there should be, in my view, some level of transparency so that the viewer can look at something and say, oh, look, this is a quote unquote real image, or this is a real image that was enhanced with AI, or this is an entirely AI image, or any combination of those things. So it's really about allowing people to see where something comes from, and then they can make choices as to whether they want to look at that information or pay attention to it or whatever the case might be.
Very much. I would like to move on to the last big topic on this AI panel, which is copywriting. I think this is one of the major issues that is to be addressed, I'm afraid, probably through courts and not through most of the discussions that we have, but still I want to talk about this. There are two types of copyrights that we have to distinguish to understand the issue. The one is the input and the other one is the output. So the input means there are many images that are put into learning models, and then there's something coming out on the other end. And is it allowed for companies to use these images legally without paying royalties to the people who have made these images? And then on the output, it means that the images that are created through generative AI have a copyright of the person who has prompted. So these are the two copyrights that we're talking about. Heinrich, what do you think when we're talking about outputs, so the images that are coming out of generative AI, should these images have a copyright of the person that has put in the prompt?
It depends. Depends which model you're using. If you're using DALL-E or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or Adobe Firefly. Shout out to Santiago's company, Adobe. They did the right thing. They trained Firefly only on or mostly on available Adobe stock imagery, which was already cleared, if I understand correctly, and also public domain images. So that's also the reason why Adobe, I think 4 days ago, they released the newest batch of Creative Cloud applications. And since a couple of days, you can officially use those Firefly elements in a commercial field, meaning, or I read it as you could publish them because the rights are cleared. But other image generators like Midjourney or OpenAI's DALL-E, they're like big vacuums. They hoovered the whole internet, and everybody's images were like included, and they even hoovered piles of data that already hoovered the internet. So the big scraping project. Anyway, so my criticism towards these companies is they didn't really care about copyright in the first place. All they cared about was training their models, no matter what. And now, after the fact, they offer the creative industry to opt out. But I would rather have had the opportunity to opt in, like to, yes, I agree, my material can be used, and not automatically have it used, and then I have to become active and actively opt out and have it taken out. But again, that's in German I would say verschüttete Milch, so that's spilled milk. And what was the question? Should they be copyrighted? And the answer is I don't really know. I'm really at a loss here. I think, especially as long as the generated material relies on stolen material, it should definitely not be copyrightable, because then it would be some sort of laundering, I would say. Creating generated images through a machine on the basis of stolen material shouldn't be eligible to copyright, I would say. But in the case of Firefly, where it's already cleared, maybe yes, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's not really easy to answer this question. For me, I mean, prompting, you could see already as a creative process, no? But of course, if the training is using all the image material, you can imagine it's really not totally clear. Yeah, I think it's a good idea to say, like, if you change the image, the output, and make something out of it, like I do it. So I make videos, I'm doing different kind, I'm also not prompting, but so I'm training, it's a different thing because I use my own material. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, then
I'm not. I think it's maybe it's on the time to speak about it, but I think it's really hard to already answer this question because I'm a fan of a copyright. I think it's important to have it. So because there was also discussion about no copyrights anymore, I think it's still need to be copyrights on text and image and artworks and so on, music. But I think there's the same problem in all these kind of fields right now because it's all involved in AI. So music has the same problem, the music industry and so on. So I think this is, yeah, I think for sure if it's a commercial use, so for example, then I would say you have to be clear, it has to be clear that it's your work. So maybe there's something in Adobe you can kind of filter with the AI if this kind of work is already existing in the world and someone holds a copyright. And I mean, maybe it's possible with an AI technology to find out. Yeah.
So use AI to discover AI.
To say now this, like Roger Bellin, you generate an image looks like Roger Bellin. So the AI says, no, but you can't hold the copyright on this work because there's Roger Bellin, famous photography, already holding the copyright to works. They look really the same. So I don't know. This could be maybe a solution to ensure that this is really your work.
I mean, are you afraid as an artist that you might lose the uniqueness of your art? Because as it seems, there are courts that are in favor of deciding that when these images are scraped and they're afterwards refined a little bit, then it is illegal to use them without appropriation of the original creator. So that could mean people would be able to create images in your style and then sell them, which would be totally legal. Are you afraid that you might lose basically your own style for something commercial from others?
Well, I think this already happened to me 8 years ago when someone took pictures in the really exactly same way as I did, and we had a copyright discussion about this work because I could prove that this work was already exhibited in a museum, so that was clear this was existing before. So I think in this way, the way I work, I think I'm not really worried about that because I'm really using it in a really, I mean, experimental way, and I think it's really difficult to copy. I mean, it's not possible, but even then, as an artist, I think it's easier maybe because you exhibit the work, you maybe publish somewhere in a book, maybe as a commercial photographer as well, because you have still kind of proofs that this work was existing with the data. Or I don't know, we just heard that the metadata is not so trustful, so maybe this tool of Adobe will help also to regulate that, because there was also this opt-in, can I be trained or not? There's also a website existing, it's called Have I Been Trained? I think it's a art project where you can just type in your name and you know if your material was part of training of an AI. So I think it's I'm personally not worried, but I can imagine that some artists, photographers are worried if they have a really unique style, and you just say prompt that you want to have this style, of course.
And this would be legal. That's the main
Well,
thing.
I think I don't know if it's. I mean, maybe
the way the courts decide it might might be able to happen. But then let's take this over to Santiago, because in the US, where you are situated, a couple of lower courts have already decided that copyright will not be granted to images that are purely created by AI. But once you add something afterwards, then it might. This is still open for discussion. But then at the same time, the famous British law firm Clifford Chance has put out a paper saying, well, in the UK, this might be different. So this actually might get a copyright, even if it's just created by AI, because the law is different. And the same goes for the EU. So what do you think? What will happen to the market when there are different kinds of regulations in a market that is at its core digital?
It's a good question. I mean, we have to remember that these copyright laws were created quite some time ago, before much of the technology that we're talking about today was even invented. And as you indicated, courts here in the US have thus far said that generative AI content is not copyrightable, because one of the basic definitions for copyright is that it needs to be created by a human being. The output, the thing that you're copywriting, needs to be created by a person. So that gets to what was mentioned earlier about, well, if I do a very highly sophisticated prompt and my machine gives me an output, a result based on my prompt, is that sufficient human intervention? Right now, the courts are saying no, but at the same time, the Copyright Office here in the United States has been and is conducting what they call a listening tour, where they are going around talking to a broad cross-section of, lawyers, technologists, creatives, publishers, etc., to get additional information that will inform any maybe future adjustments to copyright law. But it usually takes a little bit of time for legislation to catch up with technology. The question is going to be, how long is it going to take in this particular case? And then there are all the nuances where I have an image that maybe was a quote unquote real image, and I altered it with generative AI, and then I did something else to it afterwards. And so, unpacking all of that, I think, is going to be complicated. So I don't know what the outcome will be, but I guess we'll see.
Well, I would like to open the room for questions of the auditorium because we're coming towards the end of our time here. Do you guys have any questions to any of our guests about AI? Okay, this doesn't seem like it. So I have one last question for Heinrich, and then I would think we would wrap up this year's edition of the Hamburg Portfolio Review. But Heinrich, it's a little bit, well, let's how to put it. The former spouse of Elon Musk, Claire Boucher, who goes by the name Grimes, she's a musician, and she has put up a synthetic voice of herself, a synthetic version, and she allowed everyone to create their own music with that voice, and says you can use it, you can publish it, as long as I get attributed and get 50% of the royalties that come out of that music. Do you think this could be a revenue model for artistic photographers to say, well, you know what, Yvonne, here you go, this is my style, you can use it, and whatever you make out of it, I get 50% of it. Would that be something that you would be willing to do?
I can't shut off the part of my brain that's asking the question, who is going to control it and who's going to manage the banking side and the accounting side. But yeah, it would be nice, but it's incredibly naive, I think. And it's, in her case, in Grimes's case, I think it's more of a marketing move, because it was, because of this bold idea, and of course she's the star and she can do it maybe, and maybe it will work out. But I think short term it was raised awareness for her brand. But I mean, in photography in Germany we have the VG Bildkunst, and since years they can't get their shit together with the accounting software, so I don't have high hopes that they can manage to send me the 50% of my cut in the future. I don't know. I'm pessimistic regarding that.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And by that, I would probably say it shouldn't be me to conclude this year's edition of the Hamburg Portfolio Review, but Andreas, who is taking up with us all for the past 3 days as the lone survivor of the sickness around here in Hamburg, as Heike and Lars are unavailable, have been unavailable in the past 2 days. So thank you very much for listening. And then I would ask Andreas to close this whole thing off, I guess.
Thank you.